Okay, welcome to Chapter 7. We're going to get into this thing called page layouts. Uh, think of the previous chapter of boxes and taking boxes and kind of now stacking those boxes in certain orders and maybe having a big box to put everything into. And so with that conceptual idea, that's basically what this page layout is all about. So when we get through with this chapter, we're going to understand the normal flow of elements, use the division element to create content containers, the div statement, the create floating layouts. These are floating layouts, so we talked about the float in the last chapter. Build flexible page layouts and build a fixed page layout. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about the normal flow of elements, and this example here on page 295 just kind of discusses that. So this is just a normal flow. We've got a title, then we've got some text split up by paragraphs, and then it's done. Okay, but when we float things, float allows us to put specific items in certain areas. And the great thing is we can use the box element to float those on the page in the certain areas that we want to. So here on page 296, figure 7-2, so we take that previous item, that previous document that just had 3 paragraphs, and now we're going to try to split it up. We're going to have a floating element where it basically has maybe some navigation information in it, and we've got our title up above. And later on, we're going to actually add a footer. And so taking this particular item and then putting it into a box, or what we call the page layout, this is basically what it looks like. So I'm trying to get this to, anyways, so here's what we have. So we've got this red line. Notice that it's the big box. We're going to call that the wrapper. That's what they call this in the book. So that just kind of wraps everything together into one big box. And then we're going to have smaller boxes. We got a header box, which is this light blue at the top. And then we're going to have our navigation, what they call the article box. Again, you can call it anything you want. That's going to be off on the left. And then over here is kind of our main page, which is this green box. And see how they all fit nice and easy into that nice boxy type of situation that we learned in the last chapter. So here's what we have. So here is a web page with multiple content divisions filled with content. So again, here's our header, here is our navigation, and then here is our actual main page. Now we're going to see borders today, but more than likely you're not going to use borders to separate out your headers and your footers and your articles and your navigation. We're not going to do that, but today we are just so that we can see the boxing and keep things boxed together. So creating floating layouts. So this is basically what we're going to create. So notice we've got the main box around it, which is our wrapper, and then inside of there we have our header, we have our nav, we have our article, and then we have a sidebar over here. This guy's float left, this guy is float right, this guy is float left. Okay, and then we have a non-floating footer. So the header and the footer are non-floating. The reason we do that is because, remember, when we float, it makes things kind of wrap around it. We don't want things to wrap around the header and footer, so we make those basically non-floating. Now, when we use actual numbers to give us height and width, we can run into problems like we see here on page 300, figure 7-6. We see that the nav box is actually extending past the wrapper. It's bigger than what the wrapper is, so it'll actually go outside of that. And we'll show how we can kind of make sure that that doesn't happen. Also, you remember how we use the overflow, and we can actually put a scroll bar in there so that that would not happen either. So we're going to use a normal flow element. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up, I forget which one this is. So float. Okay, well, let's just take a look at it. So here's what we've got. We've got a nav ID. Remember, it's a pound sign. That's an ID. And we've got a width of 180, a height of 300, and we've got it floating left. We've got a border. We've got a margin top, margin left, margin right. We've got a background color of that orange. Okay. And then we have our article. That's our main page, our main box, and it's got a width of 740, margin left of 200, border solid. Background color is white. The top margin is 20. The bottom margin is 20 as well. Okay. We do have a margin left of 200. Now, why did we do that? Well, since the nav bar is 180 wide, we're going to make the margin left for this box 200. You see what that does? That then pushes that guy off from there. So from this wrapper edge to the article edge is 200 pixels, and this guy again, it's now if we look, it has a margin right of 10 and a margin left of 10 pixels, margin right of 10 pixels. So 10, 10, and 180 is 200. So that's where the 200 comes into. We probably don't want to do that, just for the fact that we'd probably want to stick with the floating. Okay, so here's what we've got, and then here we've added a footer which has a width of 940, a height of 75, margin left of 10. Now we've got this thing called clear both. Now the reason we do the clear, remember what we did last week? We did clear left. Well, the reason we do clear both is because we want to just clean out all floats properties. Don't let this thing get attached to any float property. I want to clear everything so that it will basically be its own entity on its own separate part of that page. So we basically put a footer, we say clear both. So when you are using footers, you always want to include the clear both. Even if you're not using floats above it, it's just, if you keep it on there, it basically should not affect anything. And if you do happen to add a float later on, it basically will make sure that that doesn't happen. So again, we normally don't have borders, but in these cases, we're putting borders just because we want to show where the header is, where our nav, our article, sidebar, so on and so forth. So now, can we float something inside of a float? We most certainly can. And in this situation is what they're basically talking about here, is we have a, let's see if I can, and what we have here is we've got a quote box. We're going to call it quote box. We can name these whatever we want. We've got a quote box that is inside of another float. Perfectly legal. Not something we can't do at all. So now this box is floating inside of this box. Kind of cool. Now it's floating right, so the text will basically float around that box on the left-hand side. So it's floating to the right. So again, what they're trying to show here is we've got this article box, we've got a pull quote box over here, and it's floating to the right, and then we basically got a bunch of paragraphs off to the left-hand side. Now, if we try to put this, if we put the quote box at the bottom of our text, this is what's going to happen. If we want this quote box to appear up here, we have to put it before the first paragraph tag. That way there it will basically appear, then the paragraphs will appear around it. If we put it at the end of our paragraphs, what will happen is our paragraphs will print first, then it will try to float the box in. That's not what we want. So make sure that we do not put the floated box in the wrong place. In fact, we would put this floating quote box between the article head and the first paragraph. That's where it needs to go. Another problem we can have is this thing called a column drop. Let's actually take a look at that code. So here's what we've got. So let me do this. Let me get to look at the book. So it's got the width of 180 for 200 there. So shoot, what do we got? 600. The container is 600. Let's see. So let's go in here and look. So our wrapper, oh, it's supposed to be 600. And we got 180, 180, and 200. 180, 180, and 200. So 180, 180, and 200. So let's save this. We should look just like it does here in the book. And sure enough, that's exactly what it looks like. So here's what we got. I'm trying to float. Now let's look at the code. So I've got column 1, which is floated left, column 2, which is floated left, and column 3, which is floated to the right. Now the main wrapper box, that main box around everything, is 600 wide, and I've got 180, 180, and 200. Now that's less than 600, right? Except let's look at our margins. I've got a margin left of 10 and a margin so that's 190, and over here I've got another margin left of 10. That's 190. But look down here. Now I've got a width of 200, margin left of 10, a margin right of 10. That's basically 220. So 220, 190, and 190, that's greater than 600. That's where we have the problem. So what we can do instead is come in here and make sure that this guy, will change it to 180. So it's the same width. So now we have, that's 200, 190, and 190. We should be good at this point. So when I save it, I come back here and look. Sure enough, I now have my column 3. Looks just perfect. Now I could have done this. I think I would have been okay with a width of 190. I think 190 would have been fine. Yep. So that basically brings it over a little bit more. Okay. So again, we got to make sure that we got it when we're looking at our numbers, trying to get this section to cross, make sure that we include the margins or padding. Well, padding wouldn't have any effect here, but margins, we have to include the margins in our width size of our columns, so that we either have to make the wrapper bigger, or we make everything fit inside the wrapper. And that's the main focus here, to make sure everything fits inside the wrapper. So again, here's a situation where I wanted my footer to appear at the bottom. So I've got column 1, which is float left, column 2, which is float left, and then I put my footer, which doesn't float at all. But the problem is the footer will fit in between the column 1 and the main wrapper. It'll fit inside there. Well, if you don't want that to happen, put the clear : both inside of that style, that CSS style for that footer, and it will automatically put that footer after all of the floats. So that's where the clear really comes into play. So flexible layouts, sometimes known as what we call a liquid layout, will adapt to the browser side. You've heard me talk about this thing called responsive. Responsive allows us to view this thing on a phone, a tablet, a netbook, a laptop, a big huge screen on a computer. It's going to basically fit every screen. Again, otherwise known as flexible or responsive. So here, instead of using actual numbers, we now use percentages. When we use percentages, now that's going to fit that particular size of the screen. So if I make something 100%, that means it's going to fit a big screen, a smaller screen, a netbook, a tablet, and a smartphone. It'll fit all of those things. So if we look here, I've got 100%. I've got my nav, which has a width of 15%. It floats left. I have a 2% margin. Here I've got a width, my article's a width of 80%. It floats left, and it has a margin left of 2%. So, and as this screen shrinks and grows, so will that particular page layout as well. Whoop. Click too many times. So here I've got my header. It's set at 75 pixels. That's the height. Margin top is 1 margin bottom is 10 pixels. It's got a thin solid black line. The background color is whatever that color is. I then have my nav, which is a width of 15%. Height is 500 pixels. Float left. And the border is a solid thin black, and it's got its own background color as well. And again, all three of these are IDs, since they have a pound sign in there. We have the article, which is a width of 80, height of 500. It floats left. It's got a margin left of 2%. Border is a solid thin line, and the background color is white. I know FFF is white. So it says, notice that the two widths for the floating elements do not equal 100% because the borders and margin contribute to the width of each element, setting the value to 100%. So if we look at 80 and 15, that's 195. I'm sorry, that's 95. And then I add my 2%. That's basically 97. So yeah, and again, you'll notice that the article doesn't quite go as wide as the header, because the header is 100%, and those two with the margin is basically all equal to 97%. So that's why it doesn't go all the way. So again, we've seen our width, we've seen our borders, we've worked with boxing. We know what boxing's all about. Now we're taking these boxes and putting them in certain places to make it look appealing in a page layout. So notice here's what it looks like in a 1024 by 768 resolution. Here's what it looks like in a 1366 wide by 768 resolution. It looks basically it looks great in either one. Notice that this floating image placeholder, it keeps floating off to the right, so it looks great. So controlling flexible layout widths. You can control the compression of an expansion of your content in a flexible layout by setting a minimum and maximum width. Now we talked about that in the last chapter. So that way there, this guy will never shrink less than this, and it will never grow past this. Because what will happen sometimes is when we look at a particular page on a super huge, you're seeing one of them really wide, they're really short but really wide monitors, it really stretches it out pretty far, and it just doesn't look right. So in those cases, we want to basically use our maximum width so that it will always look appealing and not look like it's being stretched out. So here we put in a minimum width and a maximum width, which is not a bad thing to do. So if we create a flexible layout, so here's what I've got. So here's our flexible layout activity. If we take a look at it's flexible layout finish, flexible layout finish. Okay, so here's what we've got. We got everything there. I've just commented out all of the different pieces and parts for all of the cascading style sheets. So here I've got a body, I've got a style for the H3, I've got a class called copy that's set in there, and then here's my header, my nav, my article. Okay, so if we look in here, I've got my body. So that's basically going to take place there, where it basically, well, let's just uncomment that guy out. All it's going to do is make everything inside of here a font family Arial. So when I come back over here and do a refresh, boom, notice that everything is now a sans serif font, and it's basically an Arial font is what it is. Okay, so and then if we come in here and change our H3 tag, which is now a font family Arial, margin left is 10 pixels. Okay, so I save it. Notice that our headers now moved over a little bit, so now we've got some margin on our headers. And I also want to take this, we'll talk about the copy here in just a second. Okay, so here I've got a div ID wrapper. So do I have a wrapper up here? No, I do not. I need to put that in, don't I? Well, apparently we're not using a wrapper for this one. Okay, so I look. Oh, here's my wrapper. What am I looking at? Oh no, that's the other one. Sorry, my bad. Okay, so now here's a really, let's talk about this real and I want to emphasize this a lot. Is notice that this div tag has an ending div tag. This div has an ending div tag down here. Okay, this div tag has a, so here's what it does. Is this div tag right here, the very next ending div tag is the one that's going to go with it. Okay, so whatever that is. So here's a div tag, div article, and yep, apparently this one goes with that. A lot of times what we like to do is put in a comment, which is a less than sign, exclamation point, dash dash. We could say end article. And then you have to tell it you're ending your comment with a dash dash greater than symbol. So anything between these two tags is considered a comment. So now I know that this div tag goes, I want it to go with that guy up there. Here's my class copy, so let's undo that so that, let's see what it does. And again, all it did was basically put a margin on a margin left on our paragraph tags. Okay, on that particular paragraph, because all the paragraph tags have a class copy on them. Okay, so now the one thing we don't have is an ending div tag for the wrapper class. Now you don't have to do this, but boy does it really make it easy to kind of follow later on. Again, we don't have a wrapper class in here right now, but we'll add that style here in a little bit. So again, notice that from here to here, everything is inside of that wrapper class. Remember how we have the big box around everything. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is let's do this. Let's undo our header. Let's uncomment all of our headers, and we'll talk about each one. So it's got a height of 80 pixels. We've got a margin top of 10 pixels. We've got a margin bottom of 10 pixels. We want to align our text centered. We want a border of a nice thin black line, and we're going to have a background color of whatever color that is. So I save it. I come back over here, and there it is. So there's my header. There's this nice box, background color. Boom, there's our first box to go within our page. So then the next thing we have is this navigation area over to the left. And what I want it to be, it's again, since it's going to be within a div tag, it's going to be its own box. It's going to float left. It's going to have a width of 15%. It's going to have a height of 500 pixels. It's going to be text-align centered. It's going to have a thin black border, and it's going to have a different background color as well. So when I save it and I come back over here and do a refresh, there is my navigation now. Okay. So now it's looking pretty neat. Now notice the text is up against that because we haven't set any margins or anything for this box article yet. So we come back over here, and with our article, again, now how did we use those tags? Well, here's my div ID header, and there's my header, and then here's and again, here's the ending div tag for the header. And then here's my div tag for the nav. I've got navigation. Here's each one of those different links that we've got in there. And then here's the ending div tag. And I could do this. I could say, so that now we know what that div tag basically goes for. So everything between here and here is within that nav. So it's its own box. Then I have my article tag. So here's my article tag, and it basically comes down here. It's got all that, and here's the end article tag. Okay, so come back up here. If we look, it's also float left.